Hi there, I'm Steve Bauer, County Commissioner, and I want to welcome you to Commissioner's Corner. You know, the county provides a lot of services to people that I think the folks just don't know much about, and one of them I want to talk about a little bit with a great partner is the Cooperative Extension Service. We operate this program with Washington State University, and it's a program that probably touches more residents of this county than any other service that the county offers. It ranges from the 4-H program for young kids, and if you made it to the fair this summer, you got to see those kids and their animals, and I love that program because it teaches kids about animals and raising them. It teaches them, they train them, but it also teaches them responsibility and a self-confidence that they carry through with them in terms of the rest of their life. But it's not just for kids. The extension program has a Beach Watchers program, so if you're interested in Puget Sound and Hood Canal and you want to volunteer in this program, you'll get extensive training on the saltwater environment, the animals in the water, the uplands, and how all of that works together. It is really important, I think, with the information we're getting about Hood Canal and Puget Sound, that we have citizens who know more about that. Once you're trained, you can train other citizens, and you can also work on projects that'll protect and preserve Puget Sound and Hood Canal. So the Beach Watchers program is important. Nutrition program is traditional home economics that we usually think of. If you've got a small parcel of land and you want to do some farming on it or forestry, you can take classes with the extension and learn how to be stewards of those programs. In your own home, you can be a master gardener and learn how to take care of the plants and everything in your yard, and then also serve as an expert and a resource for your neighbors. So the extension program, I think, is really one of the best bangs for the buck that we get as a public, and it's a great partnership between WSU and the county. So what I want to talk about today is one of those parts of this partnership between the county and the extension program, and that's called the county's Noxious Weed program. Now, before I met our speaker today, I have to tell you that I thought a weed was anything that the chemical companies couldn't sell you chemicals to fertilize and do all the other things. So if you take the dandelion, for example, the greens you can eat, the flower looks attractive, you don't have to fertilize it, you don't have to water it, even the seeds are great, except we call it a weed. Okay, so my wife doesn't think that analogy works very well either, but I like it. But that dandelion becomes obnoxious to me when it's in my neighbor's yard by the tens, and I've worked really hard to get it out of my yard. So I think that most of us, when we think about noxious weeds, we think in terms of the neighbor's thistles or dandelions and stuff. We're more used to thinking of invasive species, and that's really what a noxious weed is, when we think of wildlife. So we think about people who brought new fish streams into an area that eat all the native fish fry and decimate the native populations, and then we've got to go through the process of trying to get rid of them. If you look at the zebra mussels and the Great Lakes and how they're clogging all the intakes, again, you have a foreign and invasive species coming in and displacing the native species, and that's what happens here even with plant life and weeds. That we don't tend to think of it that way, but they come in and they displace the native species, they threaten the environment, and we're here at Jarstead Park today in Gorst, and one of the reasons we're using this site to talk about this topic is that there's a salmon stream right behind us that has a big salmon run. You'll see some of the pictures later, and the invasive species really impact the salmon streams in this area, and some of the noxious weeds, we'll talk about one of them today, like tansy ragwort, actually are lethal to animals, and others we'll talk about have negative effects on people. So my guest today is Dana Coggon, who is the director of the County and Extension Noxious Weed Program. And I've already shown that I can make this topic deadly dull, but I'll guarantee you that Dana has a huge passion on this whole topic of noxious weeds. She brings this topic to life. She's really a great speaker, and I'm really thrilled that she'd spend the time today to talk to us. We'll talk a little about the program. We'll talk a little about the services that Dana offers. We'll go through and talk about some of the actual noxious weeds that exist in the county, why we need to be concerned about them, what we can do to eradicate them, and then at the end, I think talk about what you and I can do in our own yards and our own property to try and control these. So welcome, Dana. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me to come out to such a beautiful space.
It is. So why don't you tell us a little about your background, how long you've been with the program? How does somebody become a noxious weed expert?
Well, you know, since I was a little kid, I dreamt of being the noxious weed control coordinator of a
Really?
county. No. Actually, I grew up in a small town in Oregon. It was a farming community, so we did have a lot of agricultural impacts around our area. I spent many summers out in the fields actually picking berries and doing fun things like that. When it became time for me to go ahead and stretch my wings a little bit and go to school, I chose an agricultural school in Colorado. I went to Colorado State University and started my schooling there in wildlife biology, and really just had a passion for plants within that program, and realized that plants are the basis of all life. And in getting into more of the program itself, I realized that our plant species were being impacted by invasive plant species and other invasive species within our region and within our nation. I finished my undergraduate degree with a degree in what's called bioagricultural sciences and pest management. I like to tell people it's really just a way to say fancy farming. I learned how to use insects to control weeds rather than to use herbicides to control weeds, and we worked with the land and worked with how to best heal the system for a sustainable program. I then actually stayed on at Colorado State University and received my master's degree in weed science. And yes, it actually says that on my diploma. It's really a fun party trick. When people come over, they want to see my diploma and see, does somebody really get a degree in weed science? And so I do have a master's degree in weed science from Colorado State University. Through my master's degree program, I really just became more involved and more engaged with the natural resources field of things. I went from the farm and realized that I love farming, but that there's this whole system out there that also plays an intricate role in sustainability, and really started looking at the plants on our natural areas. I moved out to Washington to be the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board's education specialist. So I actually went all around the state of Washington for about 3.5 years, educating general citizens and also other coordinators about new invasive species that were up on the rise and coming kind of from our shorelines and from the east side of the state also. Through that time, I really realized that weeds know no boundaries. No matter where we're at, weeds will show up and they will hitch a ride on whatever they can. They're some of the best hitchhikers we know. Right now in western Washington, we are being inundated with quite a few invasive weeds from eastern Washington.
I'll be darned.
We stopped really producing a lot of hay in our region, so now we need to get hay from eastern Washington. And every year I get a phone call of somebody saying, you know, I got a bale of hay in, it's got a weed in it, I'm not sure what it is, but it's now been spread all over my field because my horse has now moved it. What do we do? So I moved from the state level and started really saying that I wanted to make a difference locally. I wanted to be active in one general area, and I was lucky enough to be placed here in Kitsap County. I have been the weed control coordinator now for 4 years. I am the first weed control coordinator here in the county. Kitsap County was one of the last 2 counties in the state of Washington to actually follow through on the state law and place a noxious weed control program in their county. The state law, RCW 1710, mandates that every county has an active weed control program to actually help reduce the impacts of invasive species within individual counties.
So we'll talk a little more about why that's really important for every county to have their own program. But for now, talk to us a little about the services that you offer in the program. Is this a regulatory program? When you're driving down the road, you see somebody with weeds and you go over and, you know, cite them, or is this more an educational outreach? Just what do you do in the program? And you are the program, by the way.
Yeah, I am the program.
Okay.
So it's me. If you see me on the roadside, you know, with a little sign that I've printed off in the office that says Noxious Weed Control Program, I'm the only one here in the office. And the law provides us with the regulatory background, but my goal is to actually educate citizens. We've found that if you allow people the opportunity to learn about invasive species, 90% of the time they're actually going to make an effort and they're actually going to control it on their own properties. Nobody wants a nuisance, and most of the time they're willing to get rid of it. So what we do is I do roadside surveys. I will drive around, and if I happen to see an invasive species on someone's property, I will send them an educational sheet that says what the plant is, how to identify it on their property, and then I ask them to call me so that we can actually talk about how to manage that specific plant on their property. Often I get phone calls from folks wondering what specifically can they do to get rid of all of their weeds. And I tell people that we need to treat weeds as if they're a disease, and there's not just one way to control everything, that you need to take each piece and part. There was a fish jumping.
Yeah, that's right.
This is actually one of the reasons why I did choose this space, is that it is phenomenal to see those things.
Yep. So you send them the letter.
We send them a letter, and we do educational events and outreaches. I think kind of the feather in our cap this year was that we did what I was calling the weed menagerie. And I would actually load up my truck with noxious weeds and travel to the various parks to educate citizens in the parks of what was there and what they can do to help. I think it's really important not only to know what you have in your own backyard, but realize that in our public spaces we do have invasive species, and that it is important for each of us to do our part. One of my little cheesy slogans is do your part, don't let weeds start. And that really seems to kind of work with folks, because if you take one plant and remove one plant a year, you can remove millions of seeds from getting into any other system. Even just standing here at this spot today, we're surrounded by some tansy plants, some tansy ragwort, which is a plant that was brought in as a hay contaminant and has moved not only from the farms and fields, but now into our natural areas. This plant is toxic to horses and cattle and to goats. So it's not one that we can use goats to control, because it is toxic. But each one of these plants can provide up to 1 million seeds a year.
Wow.
So one a day keeps 1 million away.
That explains why I've got all these things growing in my garden I keep trying to put down. Okay, so let's get right into it. I know you brought some examples here. So I think the important thing, though, in terms of describing the program, one of the things I like about the way you do this is that you really work with people. I haven't heard enforcement in part of it. What I've really heard is that you're a great speaker, and so people want you to come talk to their group. You can, and it's really an educational mission. You can work as an advisor to individual property owners and to help them understand and to coach them. And then I gather you also put together work parties and rely on volunteers to come out in settings like this and deal with some of the eradication of the things we'll talk about today, right?
We do, yes. And one of our main goals is the education piece of that. And then with that education, we do want to engage people to be active within our program. With it being an army of one, it is much appreciated when I get what we call our weed warriors to show up and help us on various sites. And the great thing is that within this county, we've got many citizens who are willing to come out and help us. We typically hold at least one weed pull a month on a publicly owned piece of property. So if you're interested in finding out where that is within your area, please contact our office and we can get you on our mailing list so that you'll know where we're at.
And we'll show you slides at the end of the program that let you know how to contact the Extension Service and also how to contact Dana directly. So let's get into some of the examples you're bringing with us today, and why don't we just dig in and show us what you've got, tell us why it's a problem, what we're doing to try and manage them.
Well, I'm going to start off with probably one of the most controversial plants that we actually get questions about at the Weed Control Office. This little plant, as many folks know, is a plant called butterfly bush, and it's a gorgeous plant. I often tell people that I have a fond respect for many of these invasive species. Many of them are beautiful plants, but as I say with a lot of these, beauty is only stem deep. This plant is kind of a chameleon. It looks beautiful on the outside, but when you really get down to the root system of it, it is probably one of the most devastating plants that we are starting to see pop up in Kitsap County.
Really?
I have referred to this as our state's next Scotch broom. When Scotch broom was initially noticed in the state of Washington, people thought it was really pretty and they planted it in their backyards and they loved it. And now if you ask anybody in Western Washington what is their main plant that they despise in the state of Washington, what do they normally say?
Horsetails.
Horsetails. And then what's the next one?
Scotch broom.
Scotch broom, there we go. So Scotch broom is a pretty big nuisance, and we are actually seeing butterfly bush outcompete Scotch broom.
Wow.
If there's anything that can outcompete Scotch broom, I'm a little concerned about that. Now, I am not going around telling folks that they must remove their butterfly bush plants, that they have to get rid of it. I'll even tell you a dirty little secret. I had the birds plant 3 of them in my own yard 2 years ago, and I didn't completely remove them. Because you can actually effectively control butterfly bush by going out every year, right about this time of year, and cutting it off to about 3 feet, leaving 3 feet of it above ground. The following year, you'll actually get a fuller butterfly bush plant. What you want to do then with the material that you cut off is please do not put this in your personal compost. And the reason why is that each one of these little seed heads or flower heads produces over 30 million seeds.
What?
So this is a time bomb waiting to go off if you put it into your compost pile. I often say that the best thing to do with many of these noxious weeds is to actually go ahead and bag them and put them into the trash. The reason why is that sometimes when you compost a lot of these weeds, not all of the seeds actually desiccate quickly enough. We actually do have a really good program here in Kitsap County, though, that most of the yard waste that you do put into your yard waste bin does actually go and it gets incinerated before it is put into the compost. So our yard waste bins are safe.
Great.
So butterfly bush is one that we just encourage you to enjoy it. Cut the flower heads off, bring it inside, it smells beautiful. When you're done with using it inside, go ahead and just put it into the trash or into your yard waste bin.
Okay, what else you got for us?
Well, we've got the next plant that I think is probably one of the most aggressive plants that we have actually in not only Kitsap County, but in Western Washington. I often call this plant the triple threat. This is commonly known as knotweed, or there's a grouping of plants. There are actually 4 different types of knotweed in the state of Washington that we're concerned about. So often we refer to them as just the polygonum species that we're fairly concerned about. This plant was brought in also as a garden ornamental. It was brought in as a natural fence. And if you've ever seen this plant along a stream side or in a yard, you will notice that it creates a very, very dense natural fence. If you look at the back side of this plant, you can see that it actually has some pretty intensive stalks that resemble bamboo. And this is actually what a lot of people refer to as poor man's bamboo. The difference between this and bamboo is that you'll notice that the leaves are quite a bit larger than they are on the bamboo. And on bamboo, you'll never see these bright white flowers. Now, this plant is particularly important along our stream corridors, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come to this site also, is that we have a beautiful spot here that has a lot of restoration work that's been done here.
Right.
And we want to make sure that we preserve a space like this. On this stream, there are actually some sites of knotweed that have been identified just downstream from where we're at, and then this morning we did just have a report of some other patches upstream from this area. The concern with that is that this plant is what we call a triple threat. It reproduces both by seed set, stem fragments, and by root fragments. And it's the root fragments that are particularly important along a stream system, because they can then be mobile and move all the way down the system from the headwaters.
And you showed, and we'll show a picture on the film here, of it actually crowding out a riverbank. And what you were telling me earlier is that part of the reason we want to be concerned about this is it is so dense that it'll actually crowd into the stream and close the stream off. I know that from what you've talked about, and I've talked to other folks, that in order to get rid of this is a 4 to 5 year period. You've got to keep coming back, so it's really expensive and intensive to stop it. But if we don't, then it really threatens the streams, and that's one of the reasons we wanted this site, was to talk about the effect that these have on the salmon and the streams we've got.
Exactly. And you know, one of the things that we talk about also is that, especially with the noxious weeds,
Yeah.
which are highly aggressive, extremely invasive, and very difficult to control, with those plants in particular, we want to work with folks to prevent infestations from spreading.
Yeah.
We want to control what we currently have, but really prevent it from taking over areas like this.
Okay, let's see what else you got.
All right, so we have a couple of other things. This one doesn't look so threatening, and I don't know if you can get a close-up of this guy.
It's pretty.
This is a very beautiful plant, and I will send some photos also that will show of it taking over a forested area. This is a little plant called lamium. You often get this in hanging baskets from your local nursery, and it's beautiful as it cascades out of the baskets. The challenge is that often we think that our baskets are dead at the end of summertime, so we take the baskets and put them into our compost pile.
All right.
This plant is part of the mint family, so if anybody knows much about getting mints into an area, they know that once you've got it, it's really difficult to get rid of. At every single point where these leaves come out on this plant, it will reroot itself.
Okay.
And we have seen this rapidly taking over our forest floors. In fact, this is the one plant that we are seeing compete with
Really?
ivy.
No kidding.
We are seeing the lamium actually cover the ivy. Ivy, though, is one of those plants that has figured out how to outsmart us a little bit, that it doesn't just stay on the ground, it has now moved up into the trees. So these two species actually coexist quite happily and absolutely decimate the native plants that are in our forest floors.
One of the things that we'll have a couple of other slides to show, but these weeds are all over the county. It's not just one or two. You've got some slides that show the sites that you personally have surveyed. So when people think about, well, it's maybe just Jarstead Park, it's really all the way through the county that these different kinds of weeds occur, right?
It is, and as I stated before, weeds know no boundaries. So the weeds are not only on publicly owned properties, but they are on privately owned properties. My database right now is over 15,000 sites that I have personally visited in the last 4 years that I've identified noxious weeds on both public and private properties.
Okay, let's see what else you got.
Well, this is one that I'm particularly concerned about. This is a brand new plant, and we've talked a lot about shoreline stewardship in this county, and we're looking at actually going back through and doing our new shoreline plans and all that fun stuff. So shorelines are a key to this county. I believe that Kitsap County is one of the jewels that we have here in Washington. We are an amazing county that has the influence of the Hood Canal on one side and the Puget Sound on the other, and we have a unique opportunity to preserve this great space. This is a plant that we have found absolutely taking over some natural areas on Bainbridge Island and just outside of Indianola. It's a shoreline plant that does not mind salt, so it likes the saline conditions. And check out the root on this guy. This is actually the biggest concern that we have with this plant. This is a plant called perennial pepperweed. It reproduces both from seeds, which are literally the size of pepper granules, and then from this rootstock. On Bainbridge Island, we have a site that it was 160 feet long by 60 feet deep.
Wow.
Solid of perennial pepperweed. There was absolutely no other plant species underneath this plant.
So this just crowds out all of the native vegetation when it comes in.
Crowds out all of the native vegetation and reduces any of the seed set that native birds and other native shoreline species need to survive. This is actually a very dead plant, obviously, right now, but don't be deceived, because what we have found is that with a root system, even on a plant that looks this dead, if I were to plant this tomorrow, it would actually resprout next year.
I'll be darned.
So remember, we said that noxious weeds are difficult to control. This is a plant that we do have to actually use some herbicides on. I talk to a lot of folks about herbicide use, and I say that we use herbicides like they're an antibiotic. We're using the herbicides to help where we need it, when we need it, and to heal the system. So my philosophy in weed control is to get the system back to an equal balance where the natives really can thrive.
Great. What else we got?
Well, the next one we have is probably one of the most talked about weeds in Kitsap County. And later I'll show how to actually get or use the weed wrench that you can borrow from our office. That is one of the services that we do provide here in Kitsap County, is that we have 3 weed wrenches that you can borrow from our office for a fee of $20. You then get to keep the weed wrench for a week to 2 weeks. And I'll show you later, but the weed wrench, I've coined the weed wrench the Kitsap County Fitness Plan. It's a large
I tried it
tool.
earlier and it works.
It does work, and
Yep.
actually I wish that we would have gotten the video of you pulling that out.
Struggling with it.
No, it's a good little tool to pull out Scotch broom. The challenge that we have with Scotch broom is that it is very widespread. Every year I get a phone call of people saying or asking me specifically, when are we going to start controlling the Scotch broom in the county? When is the roads department going to start controlling the Scotch broom? And I would like to actually give kind of our roads department and the state road crew a little attaboy, because they've actually done a fairly decent job of trying to keep it at bay. When you're looking at one of these plants, each one of these plants creates millions of seeds. These seeds are viable anywhere between 40 to 70 years. This is a plant that no matter how much we work on it right now, we're going to have to continually do maintenance. I had somebody ask me the other day, well, what would it take to get the road crew to actually control all of the Scotch broom in Kitsap County? And to get the road crew just in Kitsap County to control all of the Scotch broom would take no less than $1 million a year.
So let's talk about, we've only got a couple minutes left here. Let's talk about, for folks who are watching this and me, what do we do in our own yards in terms of controlling these weeds? And then, well, let's talk about that.
So my mantra for most gardeners is deadhead, 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 which means that at this time of year when you have things setting seed, this is the time to go out and actually cut those seed heads off and put them into the trash. It's really important to realize that 60% of our invasive plants are escaped ornamentals.
Really?
So it's really important to know that what you have in your backyard, you might not see it spread in your backyard, but it's the little birds that come in during the winter time and take your seeds and distribute them. So use bird seed rather than using weeds to bring in the plants, the birds to the plants. I think it's really important that folks know that we are here for educational purposes.
Right.
You can call and you can get advice from our office. Unfortunately, this year we had to kind of cut back on how many site surveys we were doing. My headlamp gave out, so I wasn't able to do as many night surveys as I wanted. But we do come out oftentimes with folks and help them create a management plan on their property. But those are few and far between right now because, again, there is only one of me, but we are trying our best to get the education and information out there.
That's great. I want to, so we'll show slides on the screen. You'll see how to contact the extension programs. You'll see how to contact Dana for information about weeds and also volunteer opportunities. So I want to thank you for coming out. I want to thank BCAT for filming this. I want to thank all of you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.